All right, everyone. Well, I'd like to welcome you to today's REL Midwest Making Connections webinar focused on strategies for using school climate data. My name is Bree Martin, and I serve as a researcher and policy analyst with REL Midwest. And before we get started with today's webinar, I'd like to begin with a brief overview of REL Midwest and tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we do. REL Midwest is part of a network of 10 regional educational laboratories funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences, or IES. Based in the Chicago area, REL Midwest serves the educational needs of Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and is administered by the American Institutes of Research. REL Midwest's charge is to improve academic outcomes for students by helping states, school districts, and schools systematically use data, conducting and supporting high-quality research and evaluation, and promoting evidence-based decision-making. In other words, REL Midwest helps educators and policymakers expand their knowledge and understanding of research and its value to decision-making and education reform. We do this by identifying, conducting, and supporting research targeted at meeting state, district, and district needs. Within the Midwest region, we've conducted a variety of need sensing activities across the region, from the review and analysis of public data to surveys and telephone interviews, personal conversations with educators, and more formal meetings with education policymakers, and have identified 4 priority areas for research: college and career readiness, early childhood education, educator effectiveness, and improving low-performing schools. The actual research that emerges from these 4 priority areas begins in one of our 10 REL Midwest Research Alliances. The 10 REL Midwest Research Alliances are made up of groups of practitioners, policymakers, and other education stakeholders interested in working together to address shared problems of practice in the region. REL Midwest staff work with the members to set the research agendas of the Alliance, but the Alliances also actively contribute to the development of projects, products, and dissemination activities related to those agendas. One key aspect of REL Midwest's work to help stakeholders better understand education research in context is by linking this research to practice and policy. Our Making Connections events, like today's webinar, offer presentations of research findings by established experts, connect research findings to practice and policy, and provide opportunities for participants to engage with one another and with presenters in a collaborative discussion on education issues. For more information on upcoming events, as well as archives of our completed events, please visit the REL Midwest website at www.relmidwest.org and click on Events. In addition to our events page, the REL Midwest website provides a variety of resources, including links to publications, information about the 10 research alliances, and our Ask a REL reference desk service. For all of the latest on REL Midwest, don't forget to follow us on Twitter. As I just mentioned, the purpose of our Making Connections series are to link the work of education researchers with the work of education practitioners. Today, our focus is on school climate data, particularly on ways to effectively collect and utilize school climate data, as well as recent research from the field that uses school climate data to explore the relationship between school climate and student achievement. As part of our efforts to build a collaborative dialogue, please make sure to submit your questions through the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, as well as to respond to ongoing discussion questions in the chat box throughout the presentation. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Sally Ruddy. Dr. Ruddy is a principal researcher at AIR who focuses on school climate and its measurement. She serves as lead technical assistant and survey specialist for the National Center on Safe, Supportive Learning Environments. Her work includes providing substantive and technical guidance to 11 safe and supportive schools grantees, as well as to other states, school districts, and learning communities. I will now turn the webinar over to Sally to tell us more about today's presentations.
Thanks so much, Bree, and welcome everybody. We're so happy that you're here with us today. I did want to say just a couple of words about the National Center on Safe, Supportive Learning Environments. You'll see that there is a link at the bottom of the slide that you're looking at right now. It is safesupportivelearning.ed.gov. this has a wealth of information on school climate, including a compendium of school climate surveys, information about the 11 safe supportive grantee states, webinars about school climate, and about surveys and how to administer them, and then how to use the data and report it out. So we hope that you'll visit our website when you have a few moments. Our agenda for today will include 3 very interesting presentations. The first one is going to be presented by Adam Voight. He is a climate technical assistance and research specialist at WestEd, and he will be talking about a climate for academic success. We'll then have a Q&A session after Adam's presentation. And again, as Bree mentioned, you can just type your questions into the Q&A pod at the bottom, or you can email them to her at bmartin@air.org. And that is shown right in the, let's see if I can get my little arrow to work, up a little bit. There it is. There's her email address if you'd like to do it that way. Then we'll be having a presentation from Lisa Cheney, who's the Director of Research and Evaluation for the Kansas Safe and Supportive Schools project. And 2 folks from Maryland, Andrea Alexander and Christina Jordan, will be presenting on Maryland's Safe and Supportive Schools program as well. This will be followed by another Q&A session at the end, and then we'll be ending up with reflections and future directions. So that's our overview of what we'll be talking about today. And first of all, we'd like to have a polling question here. If folks would please take a moment to answer our question. Which of the following best describes your current role? School or district administrator, district office staff, K-12 teacher or teacher leader, representative of higher ed, state education agency staff, state-level legislative staff, researcher, or other. And if you are other, if you would please specify in the chat box, that would be very helpful to us. So I see we have folks answering the question. We'll take another moment here for people to respond. And it looks like we have the largest percentage are research, followed by other. Please specify. So if there are some folks, let's see, we have elementary school counselors, consultants, nonprofit ed policy, secondary literacy coach, nonprofit ed policy again. So elementary school counselor. So thank you very much for that. This kind of gives us an idea of who the audience is so that we can make sure that we're giving you the best information possible. So I think we have another poll question too. Bree, if you would pull those over. How do you use school climate data in your current role? To inform my instructional practice, to identify issues of disproportionality, for example, suspensions or attendance, to modify department or small learning community curriculum and instruction, to monitor individual student or student group progress, and again other, and if so, please specify in the chat box. Or I do not currently use school climate data. So let's see what we have here. It looks like 41% is our largest percentage to identify issues of disproportionality, such as suspensions and attendance. And the next is 30% on monitoring individual student or student group progress. 23% is other, and we have to coach and teach educational leaders, to identify promising policies and programs, evaluation and consultation with districts, to identify, to guide our district-wide SEL implementation, that is social-emotional learning, to determine how safe children and staff feel in their school. So some very interesting results here. So thank you so much. That really gives us a better picture of who you are and what sorts of things you're doing. So thank you for that. So moving on, I think we have to go up one here. There we go. I'd like to introduce now Adam Voight, who's going to be giving a presentation on a climate for academic success, how school climate distinguishes schools that are beating the achievement odds. Adam is a research associate in the Health and Human Development Program and the Regional Education Laboratory, REL West at WestEd. He provides research and technical assistance leadership to the Middle Grade School Climate Research Alliance of REL West, the California Comprehensive Center, and the Safe and Supportive Schools initiative in several states. Across projects, Adam helps to build networked improvement communities between state and local education agencies and other youth-serving organizations that use data to inform continuous improvement. Dr. Voight conducts original research that examines the effects of school and neighborhood environments on youth development and the effects of youth participation in reshaping settings. His most recent work was published in the Educational Researcher and the Journal of Early Adolescence. Through the REL West, he has conducted reviews of school climate instrumentation and original psychometric research on assessments of school climate. Prior to joining WestEd, he was a research and technical assistant specialist for a community-based Centers for Disease Control and Prevention funded Youth Violence Prevention Project in Nashville, Tennessee. In that role, he researched best practices in school climate improvement and used data to help local schools and youth-serving organizations work together to improve school safety and supportiveness. He has also worked as a high school social studies teacher and counselor. He received an MA in counseling from Michigan State University and a Ph.D. in community research and action from Peabody College of Vanderbilt University. So without further ado, I will let Adam take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sally, and thank you for the opportunity to participate and share some of our work here at WestEd and REL West. I'll share with you today the results from some recent analyses of school climate data in California, the majority of which are featured in the report that Sally mentioned, A Climate for Academic Success, How School Climate Distinguishes Schools That Are Beating the Achievement Odds, and that was published this spring by WestEd. So because research is not intended to be suspenseful, I'll just go ahead and spoil the punchline right off the bat. The two main points that I'll illustrate here are one, school climate, academic performance, and student race and socioeconomic status are all intertwined. And two, academically successful California secondary schools have extraordinarily positive school climates. So how can we say that a school has a positive or negative school climate? Well, WestEd and the California Department of Education have developed an index score to represent school climate that's based on aggregated student responses to the California Healthy Kids Survey, or the CHKS. And the CHKS asks students to rate their in-school experience in terms of social relationships, activity involvement, and risk exposure. From 2008 to 2010, the years examined in the analyses that I'll present, schools in California were required to administer the CHKS as part of Title IV funding. Thus, we have student data from a large majority of statewide schools. So the index score, which we call the School Climate Index, or SCI for short, is a single number that ranges from 100 to 500 with a mean of 300. A higher score is equated with a positive school climate. The SCI includes several domains and subdomains that provide a more nuanced look at specific aspects of a school's climate, such as supports and engagement, violence victimization and substance use at school, and truancy. WestEd's and REL West's Tom Hansen has really been the leader in developing this measurement approach. Schools' climate profiles are communicated back to them in California in a school climate report card that summarizes graphically and figuratively their SCIs, their indexes, and their domain and subdomain scores. And this is an example of the report card. So I'll start out in the presentation of some of our school climate data analyses by telling you something that's unfortunately not really news. There is a racial and socioeconomic achievement gap in California schools. This graph depicts the Academic Performance Index, or API, of statewide public middle and high schools on the y-axis, and the percentage of students of various demographic backgrounds enrolled in the school on the x-axis. The API is California's school accountability criterion, and the dotted line, horizontal dotted line here indicates an API of 800, which is considered successful according to the state accountability system. And again, all of this data is from 2008 to 2010. So on average, and all of these interpretations should be taken as on average interpretations, as the percentage of Asian students in a school increases, the school's API also increases. As the percentage of white students increases, API increases. And as the percentage of Latino and African American students increases, we see a decline in API, and this decline is also evidenced in schools with more low-income students, indicated by their eligibility for free and reduced price lunch, FRPL. So again, this isn't really news for most of us. Schools that serve large proportions of African American, Latino, and low-income students tend to have lower levels of academic achievement. Now let's look at the relationship between school climate as measured by the School Climate Index and student demographics in California middle and high schools. So we'll substitute API on the y-axis here with schools' School Climate Index scores, which range from 100 to 500, and higher numbers again represent more positive school climates. As we saw with academic achievement, when the percentage of Asian students enrolled in the school increases, school climate becomes more positive. The same is true for white students. And just with academic achievement, schools with more Latino, African American, and low-income students tend to have more negative school climates on average. So while the existence of an achievement gap is not really news, the school climate gap may be more novel, or at least if you'd already suspected it, now you have some empirical evidence here. Okay, so a school's climate, academic success, and student demographics are all interrelated. And the story that these interrelationships tell is one that poses a challenge to us in terms of race and socioeconomic status. There's a racial and economic achievement gap, as well as a school climate gap. So with this in mind, let's take a look at how school climate is related to school success, defining success in a way that takes student demographics into account. There are two fundamental ways to define success, using absolute criteria and using relative criteria. So an example of absolute criteria is the API, California's Academic Performance Index. All schools are held to the same standard, regardless of the context of the school. If you have an API of 800 or higher, you're successful. If you have an API below 800, you're unsuccessful. One problem with measuring success in this way is that it doesn't really consider the reality of the gaps that we just reviewed. So for example, consider the number of low-income students that a school serves, again, as indicated by eligibility for free and reduced price lunch. So there's a huge discrepancy here in the income levels of students in successful versus unsuccessful schools when we define success in terms of API. So for schools that achieve APIs of 800 or higher, the blue bar in the chart here, approximately 20% of enrolled students are low income on average. For schools that do not meet the API requirement for success, nearly 60% of students are low income, more than twice as many. So ignoring these differences when defining success ignores the really enormous challenges that some schools face regarding economic, social, and cultural capital. So relative criteria, an alternative way of defining success, take differences in student demographics into account. So an example of this would be a similar schools rank, which is something that the California Department of Ed calculates for API, and this adjusts for things like race and socioeconomic status. In the study that I'll describe shortly, we define success relatively as schools that performed better than you would have statistically predicted them to perform based on the types of students that they serve were considered successful. So let me illustrate. On this scatter plot, each dot represents a school, a middle or high school in California. On the y-axis is the school's API, their academic performance, and on the x-axis, the percentage of low-income students in the school. So in general, you can see that schools with higher percentages of low-income students have lower APIs. This general trend is indicated by the diagonal line here. It shows what you would predict a school's API to be given the percentage of its students that are low income. So for example, you can see that a school with 0% of its students eligible for free and reduced price lunch on the far left of the plot is predicted to have an API of just over 800, and a school with 100% of its students eligible for free and reduced price lunch on the far right of the plot is predicted to have an API of about 600. So you can see here from the scatter of dots that not all schools perform exactly as predicted. They're not all precisely on the trend line. So schools that are above the trend line, such as this school here, perform better than expected, much better, in fact, as indicated by the really large discrepancy between their actual score and the trend line. Likewise, schools below the trend line, such as this one here, perform worse than predicted and by a large margin. So in order to be considered successful in our study, a school had to outperform its predicted value based on its student demographics by a pretty wide margin. It had to outperform expectations for all subgroups of students, and it had to outperform predictions for at least 3 consecutive years between 2006 and 2010. So these were really stringent criteria for a school to meet, and we referred to these schools that met the definition of success as beating the odds schools. Schools that performed worse than predicted for all subgroups of students for at least 3 consecutive years were referred to as chronically underperforming, and the vast majority of schools that didn't meet either of these 2 criteria were considered performing as expected. So you can see here that small groups of schools were identified as beating the odds and chronically underperforming. And I'd like to acknowledge the American Institutes for Research, AIR, who helped to develop this methodology for identifying beating the odds schools and who collaborated with us on this study. So 40 schools total, middle and high, were beating the odds, and there were different types of schools in this 40. 13 of the beating the odds schools had low poverty rates, 9 had a fair share of low-income students, and nearly half, 18 of the 40, had high percentages of low-income students, over 50% of the student body. So this illustrates that schools can be successful relative to their predicted performance across the demographic spectrum. Affluent schools are predicted to have high academic performance, and some affluent schools consistently perform even higher. High poverty schools are predicted to perform not so well, and yet some high poverty schools realize good academic outcomes for their students. So why is this? Why do some schools do so much better than we predict them to do? Well, we explored several explanations, including teacher and administrator experience and school size, but the factor that had the greatest association with success was school climate, measured using our school climate index. So schools performing as expected, the vast majority of schools in the state, had an average school climate index at the 50th percentile, right in the middle. Beating the odds schools had school climate indexes at the 82nd percentile, and chronically underperforming schools at the 15th percentile. So these are fairly dramatic differences on the order of a full standard deviation difference between groups. The standard deviation in the SCI is 50. In subsequent regression analyses, we controlled for other relevant school characteristics in looking at these group differences in school climate. And these results suggest that if you took 3 schools of equal size, equal personnel resources in terms of staff education and experience, and identical student demographics, one of which is chronically underperforming, one performing as expected, and one beating the odds, you would expect the chronically underperforming school to have an SCI of 262, the performing as expected school to have an SCI of 300, and the Beating the Odds school to have an SCI of 338. So another way of looking at this result is in terms of how school climate is associated with the likelihood or the probability that a school is classified as beating the odds. And the school climate index, again, is measured on a scale of 100 to 500 with a mean of 300. And you can see here that as school climate improves, as the index score goes up, there is an exponential increase in the probability of beating the achievement odds from a near 0% chance to greater than a 40% chance in schools with the most positive climates. So let me summarize. The old news here is that there are racial and socioeconomic gaps in achievement. Something that is a bit more novel, that there are also racial and socioeconomic gaps in school climate. And the central finding of our A Climate for Academic Success study was that when we measure academic success in a way that takes student demographics into account, school climate is very, very strongly associated with success. So there's no question that educational inequality is a big challenge for schools, but improving school climate may be a way to help schools beat the odds. And one thing that we're doing presently as a follow-up to this study is going back and doing some case study qualitative work with schools that were identified as beating the odds, our group of 40, to talk with teachers, administrators, and students, and learn some lessons about what it is that they've done to achieve their positive climates and to overcome the achievement odds. That work's being supported by the California Comprehensive Technical Assistance Center, which also was the primary supporter of the Climate for Academic Success study. So thank you. That's it for my formal remarks, and we should have some time for questions maybe.
Thanks so much, Adam. I just think that's such a fascinating study. I've heard you do it before, and every time I just think it just shows what a positive effect school climate can have for children. We do have some questions coming in. Let's see. Some are in the chat box and some are in the Q&A pod, so we'll try to get as many as we can in. One is from Rhonda. Adam, can we get a copy of the school climate survey California uses for the index?
Sure, absolutely. The California Healthy Kids Survey is actually available publicly on the WestEd website. So if you just type in chks.wested.org, you'll find the link to full versions of the survey for both secondary and elementary schools. There's also a correlated survey for staff and another for parents, and all of those are available on the WestEd website.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, what else have we got here? Laura asks, what factors are considered to be indicative of positive school climate?
Sure. Well, we, in our measurement approach, our SCI approach, we have used empirical means to identify a few subdimensions of school climate, and those include relationships between and among students and staff in the school, expectations that adults in the school hold for students' behavior and performance, perceived safety, both social and emotional, opportunities for meaningful participation, bullying and victimization, and substance use on school property. Those are some of the big categories that go into school climate as we think of it.
Okay, great. Linda asks, and here we go. Are there connections between schools with school climate success, beating the odds, and community growth and success?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm actually a community psychologist by training, and have a lot of interest in how out-of-school phenomena influence the way that students experience their life in schools and their outcomes that they advance. We don't have that kind of data at present. So we haven't done as much analysis with that. So I'd be really interested to see what some of those connections are, and I think it's a really important area for more research and more inquiry. And I should say too, just to clarify that our beating the odds schools were beating the academic achievement odds. So that was the only criteria that we used to classify them as beating the odds, and then we went back in afterwards after we'd identified our group of 40 and looked at their school climate indexes and found that they were much higher than other schools. So school climate didn't have a role in identifying beating the odds schools per se, but we just found that those academically beating the odds schools had very high school climates.
Wonderful, thank you. Aaron asks, can the relationship between school climate and performance be considered causational or simply correlational?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. It's one that is important to really be clear on it right now, I think. Our study uses longitudinal data, but the methodology that we employed really doesn't allow us to make any causal assertions. And I'm not familiar with any research, honestly, that does allow for that interpretation. There's a lot of theory to suggest that establishing a positive school climate can be a precursor or a driver of improved academic performance, but there's not a whole lot of empirical evidence at this point to support that directionality. We're in the process of doing some things with our California Healthy Kids Survey data that would allow us to be able to assert that directionality a little bit more forcefully, but at this point, virtually all of the school climate research that I'm aware of is correlational in nature. Good question.
Mm-hmm. And Lisa asks, how can school districts use already existing data to measure the quality of school climate?
Well, that's a good question, too. I guess it depends on what data they have access to. As I mentioned earlier, in California, the vast majority of schools in the state have been administering the CHKS for years, and so that's part of their existing data, and it's a really rich resource for school climate measurement. Part of our efforts through the REL West, which I'm a part of, we actually have an alliance. Our alliance structure is a little bit different from the alliance structure that Bree outlined at the beginning of the webinar. We have an alliance that's devoted specifically to school climate and using data to improve it in a group of schools across the state of California. We conducted an inventory of existing data in these schools to try to get a sense of what data are there that could help to give some indication of school climate. And we came up with an interesting and comprehensive list of things that schools have that can help with climate measurement. Things like office discipline referrals can be a good resource, and those are measured on a daily basis in many schools. Participation in after-school programs and other types of programs for youth and for parents. Those can be good indications of the degree to which students have opportunities to participate in the life of the school. There are really a lot of sources of data that if you think creatively and consider school climate broadly, that can help to assess need and monitor and evaluate the progress of climate improvement interventions.
Thank you. We've got some very good questions coming in, so get your thinking cap on. Laura asks, when the domains or factors of school climate are disaggregated, were any of the factors associated more with improved student achievement?
Another good question. No. In fact, we've found our domains and our subdomains to actually be very highly correlated with one another. And we did run separate analyses using our beating the odds group structure to see if any of our climate subdomains kind of showed up differently in terms of school group averages, and they really didn't. There were large differences between beating the odds, performing as expected, and chronically underperforming schools across all domains and subdomains. The magnitude of the differences varied slightly across domains and subdomains, but the real substantive story didn't change. That's a good question. I was really curious in doing this research if we would find that there was one particular area of school climate that really tended to be the driver of this group difference, but that didn't appear to be the case.
Mm-hmm. We have time for another question here. So this is one from Henry, another very interesting question. When you conduct the follow-up study, will you have focused interviews with minority and poor students to collect their perceptions?
I think that's a great idea. We're in the process right now of developing our interview and observation protocol. But I mean, that's a great idea. We really want to make sure that that we include input from diversity of stakeholders. And given the findings that I presented earlier on the racial and socioeconomic gaps in school climate, I think it's really important to make sure that we do include a diverse group of students in the process of doing this qualitative follow-up work. Another report that we put out at WestEd just a couple of months ago called the Racial School Climate Gap provides more specific information on the racial gap in student-level school climate perceptions, which is a really interesting and troubling phenomenon that is just kind of coming to surface in terms of research evidence. But that's a great question and recommendation.
Oh, thanks so much, Adam, and thank you so much to all of the participants with these great questions. Keep them coming in as we move on. So on to our next presenters. And actually in the chat box, Melissa asked, are there examples of states that are effectively using school climate data to not only track or measure school climate, but to improve it? And Melissa, have we got something for you? Because both the Kansas and Maryland Safe Supportive Schools grantees will be presenting some of the data that they have been tracking and some of the findings that they've had. So I'd like to introduce, first of all, the first person who will be talking is Lisa Cheney, and she is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Southeast Kansas Education Service Center. She has worked on numerous federally funded research grants for the past 20 years and has been with the Service Center since 2005. Lisa is currently the evaluator for the Kansas Safe and Supportive Schools Initiative, and she also serves as board president of Kansas Family Partnership and is a member of the Scientific Review Committee for the Kansas Youth Suicide Prevention Project and the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services State Epidemiological Outcomes Work Group. And that was a mouthful, I've got to say. And from Maryland, we will be hearing from Andrea Alexander. Andrea holds a master's degree in marriage and family therapy and is a licensed mental health professional in Maryland. She currently works for the Maryland Department of Ed, running the school climate initiatives for Maryland's Department of Education. She's the state coordinator for PBIS and the project director for Safe and Supportive Schools. With 35 years of experience in the child and family service delivery system, she has implemented several unique and successful program models in state and local government and in the nonprofit sector. Her investment and longstanding commitment to improving services for children and their families has provided her a common thread throughout her career. Also presenting for Maryland is Christina Jordan. Christina is currently a school climate specialist at Shepherd Pratt Health Systems in Baltimore, Maryland, where she has worked with the Maryland Safe and Supportive Schools Initiative since 2011. Previously, Christina served as both a special educator and school counselor in the Baltimore Public Schools. She holds both a Master's of Ed in School Counseling and a Master of Arts in Teaching with an emphasis on special education. So, without further ado, Lisa Cheney, please take it away for Kansas.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Thanks everyone for joining today, that we get to share some of the exciting things going on in our states. Start here with looking at our model for Kansas. This is our Safe and Supportive Schools model, and it's based on a model of the Office of Safe and Healthy Schools, with one exception. The OSHA model has safety, engagement, and environment pillars. In Kansas, we modified this a little bit. Our data kind of indicated that we had good reason to tease apart the engagement pillar into two pillars, actually, academic engagement and social engagement. And we found really that it's very possible for students to be academically engaged but not socially engaged, and vice versa. So this kind of allowed us to define more specific components that were reflective of our Kansas data for each of these pillars. And I'm not going to go into the different components of these pillars. If people have questions, please do ask. The goals and objectives, we really wanted schools to focus on using data and help them to implement evidence-based strategies, which were two things that schools aren't always used to doing that well. And we also wanted to make sure that through this grant we could align with our other statewide initiatives. We have a character education initiative and multi-tier system of support. We wanted to make sure these things were integrated into our Safe and Supportive School grant so we could improve our chances of having sustainability afterwards. Okay. So we have this model for our S3, Safe and Supportive Schools, in place. Our second goal was to focus on providing schools with data or scores on each of these four pillars and to calculate an overall conditions for learning index. So our first stakeholder group was quite obviously our high school students. We wanted to know their perception, their behavior, their attitude. We wanted to measure risk factors for substance use, delinquency, how safe they felt at school, how often they see other students being bullied, and not just the negative things, but also the positive, the protective factors, things such as social skills and positive involvement. And the source of the information that we used came from the Kansas Communities That Care Student Survey, which somebody was asking the question about using existing data. That is what we did here too. This is a survey that has been administered annually in our state. It's free of charge to all school districts. We've been doing it since 1995 for students in 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th grades. And of course, for the S3 initiative, we're only looking at 10th and 12th grade. We're looking at high school focus. It's supported by the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services and provides really reliable outcome data for prevention planning. So it was a good source of data to pull out some of those things related to school climate that were asked on the survey that we could use that schools were already participating in. We have very high levels of participation in the survey across the state. It focuses on health risk behaviors, violence, alcohol, tobacco, drug use, behaviors that can result in like injury, or things that get in the way of positive youth development. So it provides good baseline and trend data for us at the state level. We can also go down to the county, and the nice thing here is the district and the school building level data through this source. Okay, it measures substance use and delinquency across 4 different domains: school, family, community, and peer individual, which is important because we know obviously what happens, things don't happen in a vacuum. What happens in the family impacts what happens in school and vice versa. So we required our grantees for our initiative to have at least 80% participation of students in this survey. Okay, so in addition to students, the other key stakeholders obviously are faculty and parents. We wanted to know how these groups perceive and experience school safety and academic and social engagement in the environment. And for these, we use the Center for Excellence in Ethics Assessments, or the CIA, for faculty and staff. The CIA was developed in 2004, and it's a model of school climate and culture that's based on theory and research along 4 components: a climate of safety, faculty and staff practices, student behavior, peer-to-peer relationships, and then professional learning community, partnerships with parents. So those were the surveys that we used. And then a final source of data in the Kansas Safe and Supportive School model It's school incident data that's gathered directly from the schools and reported to our State Department of Education. And it's as required, the Conditions for Learning Index included data related to attendance, graduation, suspension and expulsion for violent acts, and then mean reading and math state assessment scores. So each of the 4 pillars that we had components from all of these stakeholder groups, from our students, faculty, staff, and then the incident data that we describe here. We had an RFP process, and we funded 30 schools across the state, and it really was a nice mixture of both urban and rural schools, which is nice to be able to have both, as you see how if and how climate is changes or is different between urban and rural. I'm going to skip ahead just a minute here because I want to show you a report here. The first step then, once the grantees were funded, was to complete a needs assessment. So each school received a tailored Conditions for Learning Index report that provided them with information needed to complete their needs assessment so they could determine their areas of strength and weaknesses to address in a strategic plan. And the data components in each pillar range from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. So to make things easy on our school districts, the data components in the report were rank ordered and color coded from high to low, and that allowed schools to very easily see areas of need. And then a school climate team got together to discuss the data and go through a prioritization process to determine their objectives relevant to the specific data. They all also completed what we called an alignment chart. It was really kind of like a logic model that made sure that their strategies that they were choosing aligned to the areas that they need to address, to make sure that there really was proper alignment among them. So we helped the schools get that information in a report form so they could begin the process and know where they needed to focus their energies and their funds. And in our 30 grantees, there are currently 42 strategies being implemented. We encouraged evidence-based strategies. Only about half are true evidence-based strategies. 7 are promising practices. And then there are some additional kind of supplemental school-based initiatives, such as incentive programs and tutoring programs and that kind of thing. Schools had a mix of environmental strategies and prevention education programs. They're implementing anywhere from 2 to 8 strategies per school. I think the average is 5. Most common strategies, Power to Achieve, and this is one that was occurring in Kansas through a character education grant prior to our S3 initiative. It focuses on key competencies. It's kind of a character education. It focuses on key competencies, such as the ability to revise, communicate, collaborate, negotiate. Then the second program for which a lot of schools are implementing is Alcohol EDU, which is an online interactive prevention course. It's designed to increase alcohol-related knowledge, discourage acceptance of underage drinking, and prevent or decrease alcohol use and its negative consequences. And the 11 Principles of Character Education is a foundational framework for stakeholders and school programs, provides structures for transforming the environment to increase safety and engagement, and expand academic excellence and social competency. Schools are required to implement universal strategies that apply to all students, as well as strategies addressing at least one at-risk or high-risk group. So this slide just shows you the percentage of strategies that were among those, the universal selected, and then indicated for the highest at-risk groups, those students that were actually already engaging in kind of problematic behavior. After the first year of implementation, survey and incident data were collected again and analyzed as schools received an updated Conditions for Learning reports. And then we compared the baseline to the 2012-2013 year for each data component in each pillar, and again, kind of rank ordered and color coded so they can see progress and compare within each component baseline to implementation. So it provided them some good feedback towards progress. And then in addition, for each stakeholder group, the report showed change in targeted components. So again, they could easily look to see where progress is and maybe is not being made. So we had an indicator if the target was achieved, it had a green, it was filled in green. So again, trying to make it as easy as possible to start really looking at and using this data to guide and inform implementation. Okay, even though it's premature to do so and we have a whole nother year of implementation and data collection left, I'll share with you just very briefly some preliminary data based upon our statewide objectives. First, 70% of grantees have seen a positive change in at least 2 of the 4 targeted pillars. 93% of grantees have moved at least 1 target on the CFL index. 47% of grantees report a decrease in the number of students who have reported being bullied. 63% of grantees report reduced alcohol consumption within the past 30 days. And 67% of grantees have reduced or maintained a rate of 0 suspensions, expulsions, and violent acts. And then finally, I wanted to show you this chart that features some of the general highlights from the data collected this spring. You can see as a collective, Kansas S3 grantees have really begun to move the needle on the pillars. The biggest gains was in the safety and healthy behaviors pillar. The least gain was seen in the environment pillar, which kind of focuses on professional community, school, family partnerships, those things that are a little harder to reach. So with that, we're having an increased focus on parent engagement and school parent communications. For this current year, the 2013-14 year, we're asking schools to create a separate parent communication plan that will hopefully improve some of those scores. So overall, positive, promising results. We're excited to see what happens in the coming year. And I think my time's up, so I'm going to turn it over to Andrea and Christina from Maryland.
Yes, you are. Thank you. Just roll in, yes, Sally? Yep, roll right in, Andrea. Okay, I'm Andrea Alexander from the Maryland State Department of Education. I'm going to describe a little bit about the Maryland S3 project. When we designed this, just at the proposal stage, we made the decision to develop it as a group randomized controlled trial. And in doing so, we also identified that the greatest strength that we could build on at this point in time was the fact that the state had taken a lead role in training over 900 of our 1,400 schools in universal PBIS, and about 800 of those, 83% of those, continue to implement and provide data to us at the state level. So we thought, since we had been unsuccessful at identifying additional resources to provide training to our local school systems in Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, this would be the perfect opportunity to build that capacity. And that's what we've pretty much accomplished as a result. So we actually enrolled 58 high schools into the project, and we have 12 of 24 of our local school systems involved. Excuse me. When I say enrolled, we had a formal recruitment process rather than an RFP process, where we actually met with superintendents and or their designees to talk about whether or not they were invested in approaching their high schools to participate in this randomized controlled study. We got 31, we have 31 in our intervention condition and 27 in our comparison/focus condition. The 31 are receiving, actually, they have the benefit of a school climate specialist who actually has about a 3-to-1 school ratio to work with the schools on using their data and on identifying interventions that might be appropriate to address that data. And that's Christina Jordan, who will be speaking in a moment, will be talking from the school climate specialist perspective. Where am I going? You do that. Thank you.
Okay, so it's this school climate model that the United States Department of Education have put together, as Lisa said, had the 3 pillars. And what we did was we selected interventions that we felt would be the most appropriate evidence-based practices to address engagement, safety, and environment. And you can see on the slide that for engagement, we focused on check and connect and culturally responsive teaching. For safety, we looked at Olveus bullying prevention and Botvan life skills. And for environment, we identified check-in, check-out, plus academic support and cognitive behavioral interventions for trauma in schools and mental health first aid. We addressed those because we felt that they would be the most successful at addressing the data. And we have now built amazing capacity in Maryland for trainers in all of those interventions across the board, which is a big piece of our sustainability model. Now, I'm just going to share with you, we also have a profile. We call it our school profile score. We use the survey data as 80% of that score. Our unduplicated suspension data for 10% of that score, and our habitual truancy data for the final 10% of that score. And those are posted publicly as required by USDE. But just some of the trends, we've now administered the survey 3 times. We do it in the spring. So Johns Hopkins University is our researcher/evaluator, and they developed the survey for us in the areas of safety, environment, and engagement. And we have learned some things already. We have the N changes on the students, but this just reflects some trends from the student data. And as you can see, there are some highlights and some lowlights. And we particularly are looking at things like drug use is a problem at their school, down at the bottom. That one's going down. But we pay attention to our N in terms of the students and our N in terms of the number of schools. Here's some engagement trend data that talks more about, are their parents informed when they do well, which has increased. Do they feel that students of all races are treated equally? That is also improving. Most of the questions from this particular school climate survey were questions that were pulled from existing validated instruments and mirror some of what the YRBS has collected, but this is at the actual school building level. And then finally for me, the environment trends, as you can see, it's really helping us focus on the right things in these school buildings. And the reality is that the difference between the control schools and the intervention schools in this is the school climate specialist. We have school climate specialists assigned to all of the intervention schools. They've been trained in all of the evidence-based programs so that they have the capability of providing that training to their individual schools if that's what their data indicates they might do. And that seems to be a model that schools are very responsive to. And that's a tough one to sustain, in that there's 10 school climate specialists at Shepherd Pratt Health System, who is our implementer/technical assistance arm of the MDS3 model. So as a segue, Christina Jordan is from Shepherd Pratt Health System, and she's a school climate specialist. And she's going to talk a little bit from a practitioner standpoint about, okay, here's the data, now what?
So the schools we're finding get inundated with data, whether it's specifically school climate survey data or some of the incident data that they have access to, academic performance data. They have a lot of information. And so what we've tried to do with the schools is help them use the school climate data to fill in the gaps, to sort of get deeper and give more information to some of those things that maybe they couldn't put their finger on before. I think Adam talked a little bit about this as that school climate being the factor that sort of either helps those schools beat the odds or maybe contributes to schools being underperforming. But oftentimes it's maybe just an assumption of what's going on in the building that's really making things progress and move forward, or what's holding some students and staff back in the building. So the school climate survey data gives us more information and helps dig a little deeper. It gives some information as to how engaged students are in the building, both in academics and in social life, if they're feeling valued, if the school environment is one that is predictable, where they feel safe. And so we kind of help the schools fit this into where they're already seeing some of these trends. So maybe they've seen that there's an increase in fights in the building, or an increase in office discipline referrals, but they're not understanding that maybe the students don't feel respected by their teachers, or there's issues in the community going on that keep students from being able to make it to school safely. So it gives just additional information. Sometimes, as I said, it validates what we've already suspected, but sometimes it's new information. So we're getting information on how students are feeling, what the adults don't see, how inclusive the environment is, and what services are available or not available in the building. And then we're also able to look at what are some similarities and differences between the staff group and the student group and the parent group, and then within each of those subgroups too, where are there some differences, and where are we lacking? We found that the staff is really interested in this information as well as the students. So sharing the data hasn't been an issue. All of our stakeholders are interested in what information the climate survey is bringing. We found some interesting ways to share data. A lot of positive ways to do this is to bring the students on board. So having the students present the data, or give even more information about what it was like to complete the survey, or what they meant by addressing certain questions, has really been valuable. Again, because it was such a large amount of information, what we tried to do was get the schools to look at this in a data crosswalk. So in terms of school climate data, we had access to the school climate survey, which was perception data from the staff, the students, and parents. We had site visit data, which looked at some observable behaviors associated with safety, engagement, and environment. We had outside observers and data collectors from Johns Hopkins University provide access to the site visit information. We looked at the school-wide evaluation tool, which measures universal interventions and the foundations in the building for providing supports to students. The individual student systems evaluation tool, which looked at the school's capacity for more targeted and intensive interventions and how they implement them. And then data that the schools already had access to, incident data like attendance rates, graduation rates, discipline referrals, and we tried to get them to bring all this together in a cohesive manner. So we could look at the trends in terms of safety, engagement, environment. We could look at the trends, again, looking at are there things that aren't filtering down from what the staff understand to what the students understand? Are the parents seeing something different from what the students or the staff are seeing? And we were also able to identify areas where the schools were doing really well and determine how we could expand on what they're doing well and the positive results they're seeing in specific areas. We also found it helpful to not only look at the big picture and to look at the data, but to look at individual stories. So bringing in that youth voice and hearing from students, specific students, about what supports in the school building helped them and where they think there are needs in the building really had an impact on the staff. And then we use the data to also help us action plan for intervention and for program improvement and overall school climate improvement. The data helped give us a focused way to begin our journey of implementation. So I think as educators, we all want to be able to help kids and improve the school, but we are able to prioritize where those high levels of need are versus some areas where maybe the school's doing pretty well and we don't need to focus our efforts. We worked a lot on working smarter, not harder, and building on the capacity of what that in that particular school building was able to handle in order to be effective. So as Kansas mentioned, we definitely aligned with some of the district initiatives that were going on. Sometimes the schools already had some areas of school improvement that were at the top of their list, and so we used the school climate data to supplement that was a need or a goal. And we looked at what resources were already available in the building and how much staff buy-in was already existing, or what we needed in order to be able to build on the biggest resource in the school building, which is the staff and the faculty. We compared this, the school climate survey is taken each spring, and so we were able to compare progress in the spring to the previous year and to baseline data. The schools were given access just this past year to an executive summary report, which has, it flags areas of concern. So the schools were able to put that at the top of their list as being a priority. And we used the data as our needs assessment to determine which evidence-based practices would be implemented in the school building, as well as giving information as to what the schools were able to handle as far as implementation. I talked a little bit about the school-wide evaluation tool and the individual student systems evaluation tool on this data crosswalk. And so that helped us look at what the school already had in place in terms of universal supports or targeted supports, and helped us direct where we wanted to go in the future.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Christina. That was a wonderful presentation for the work that you've been doing in Maryland, so valuable. And we do have wonderful questions coming in. So I think these first three are for Lisa for Kansas. The first one is, can we get the name of the Center for Ethics survey tool that Kansas used? Lisa?
Yeah, hi. Yes, it's just the Center for Excellence in Ethics Assessments, and there's one for faculty and there's one for parents.
Okay,
and they're
great.
online surveys, and you can get them from the Institute for Excellence in Ethics, IEE.
Okay,
and you can probably Google that and find that.
Okay, thank you so much. And another question comes in for you. How are the scores ranging from 1 to 5 calculated?
That's a whole nother webinar. Basically, not all of the scales and all of the questions responses are on the same scale. So we had to do some conversions, and we had to do some direction changes and so forth. So we had to create a common metric from 1 to 5, and some of them did have to be converted to make a 1 to 5 scale for the different measures.
Okay, thank you.
If somebody wants more specifics, feel free to email me or contact me, and we can go through it a little more in depth.
Okay, thanks for that offer. And we will, excuse me, have the presenters' email addresses on a final slide here at the end of the webinar. And one more for you, Lisa. How were the goals set individually by each school or for the state?
Well, the goals for the overall state in terms of reduction of kind of the GEPRA measures, the bullying, the alcohol use, and so forth, that was set as a state. However, each school, it was individualized, and each school had to select their own, not their own targets, but they selected their own areas of need, and then we determined what would be, what we would see as what would be a meaningful or statistically significant change in score, and that was their goal. So even though it was tailored and individualized, they didn't have to come up with reduced by X amount. We said that was figured kind of for them, and that became everyone's goal was to see meaningful change on whatever target area they were addressing.
Okay, thank you. And another one for you, Lisa. How would you describe the interventions and strategies that were employed by the schools in Kansas for improvement?
How would
you describe the interventions and strategies? I think it may ask which programs perhaps were used, which interventions were employed by the schools.
There were a lot of different interventions employed. I believe we have 42 different strategies selected. The majority, as we said in the webinar, were universal. The vast majority of schools, 23 out of our 30, are doing Power to Achieve, which is more of a character education type of program. There's quite a wide range. I mean, they're doing ripple effects. They're doing teen intervene. There's a whole gamut. We did not restrict the selection as long as they were on an evidence-based list.
Mm-hmm.
As long as they addressed strategies both universal and at least one at-risk or high-risk group, we did not restrict strategy selection. So there is quite a big range and mix of different programs being used. As I said, the majority are evidence-based, but they are also supplemented then with individualized school types of programs and some promising practices.
Okay, thank you. Now I think the next string of these are for Maryland, Andrea and Christina. Do any of the schools take the Youth Risk Behavior Survey by the CDC?
Actually, in Maryland, we've combined our tobacco survey that's been done at DHMH with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey for the first time this year. High schools are included, but I think that the colleague that actually is responsible for Youth Risk Behavior Survey sits on the other side of my wall, and we visually compare the 31 intervention schools with the list of high schools. I believe in the first year we may have identified 2 overlapping schools, but those schools are randomly selected versus our very formal intervention versus control school selections. So that's the best I can do with that one.
Oh, thank you. And Derek asks, are the results of this work disaggregated by race, ethnicity?
Yes, so we have several reports that can be run from the school climate survey, and the executive summary just gives sort of a snapshot of the 11 subscales that are on the survey. However, if you run an advanced report, you can disaggregate by many factors, and race and ethnicity is one of those factors that you can disaggregate the data.
Great, thank you. And one for Lisa, Kansas. Were any of Kansas's interventions, let me see at the bottom of this, targeted at improving attendance?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. We have, yes, in a sense, we have one that targets truancy. So we have a couple schools that I think are addressing issues of truancy, which targets attendance in a roundabout way. So I think there are 2 schools that are using a truancy type of strategy.
Okay.
Off the top of my head.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
This is Anne from Maryland. We also have Check and Connect is a mentoring program that that focuses completely on truancy. It's an intensive mentoring program. Christina can go into more detail if you would like more. And then Check In, Check Out is also, it's kind of like we call it Tier 1.5. It identifies a small group of students that just need a little bit more attention in the morning and in the afternoon, and that has a significant impact on attendance as well. So we certainly, engagement being one of the 3 pillars, yes, we have focused significantly on attendance of our students. We even have some schools that are PBIS schools that used truancy as the measure that students would then receive either incentives or events around as their own attendance rates improved. And we have the students telling the students to come to school. So there's been some nice work done around truancy in Maryland.
And this next question ties into that, too, for whoever would like to answer. Jane asks, can you provide the truancy curriculum? Jane, do you need a little more explanation on that one? We could ask Jane to put in the chat box.
Well, check-in, check-out is an evidence-based practice out of, I'm going to say Wisconsin, but I might be wrong. I don't have those things memorized yet. But so we actually adopted an evidence-based practice. We trained in that evidence-based practice so that if attendance came up as a concern in the data for any of our intervention schools, we would then train them in that particular intervention. Because it's a Tier 2, there is some cost to the mentoring capacity, building the mentoring capacity, but we were able to do that in the schools that have selected it because we've had the grant funds to make that work.
And if you look on What Works Clearinghouse, that's where you can find more information about Check and Connect, which is the more intensive mentoring program. It's not so much a curriculum as sort of targeted supports from the staff to the students, but they definitely give some structured activities and structured ways to measure and collect data for measuring student progress. So that is Check and Connect on What Works Clearinghouse.
Excellent. And now here's one for all four of you.
Oh, boy.
So we'll start with Adam on this one. Kelsey asks, school climate continues to be a fuzzy term for many in the field. How would each of today's experts define school climate? So Adam, we'll start with you. Be sure to unmute.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that I would imagine that the other presenters would agree that there are as many definitions of school climate as people you ask for a definition. But as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to align our definition more and more with our measure to include a series of supports, of developmental supports, like caring relationships with adults, opportunities for meaningful participation, safety, and then risk factors or issues related to violence and substance use, bullying, victimization. So we kind of have our empirical definition that's influencing more and more how we think about school climate writ large. But more colloquially, I think that a good way to think about school climate and talk about school climate is just the culture of the school, the vibe of the school, the way it feels to be in the school. I think that can be an effective way of kind of talking about or thinking about school climate that's not as jargony. But in the research that we do, we're really trying to bring into kind of synergy our more empirical definition and our conceptual definition.
Thank you so much. Lisa?
Yeah, it is a good question, and I think Adam explained it the best, but I think of it in terms of so much of what we do in Kansas has been focused on character education, so kind of the quality and character of the school or school life, because it's more than just the school. It's the relationships and the practices, the goals, the values, the norms of students and faculty. And I would venture to say, if we're talking environment too, you're talking about the community as a whole. So a really broad perspective, which is still very fuzzy. I agree with that, but that's kind of the way we think about it in terms of the quality and character of school life.
Okay, Andrea?
Well, in our presentation, for some reason I got kicked off, but on the presentation that has the school climate profile with the three pillars of engagement, safety, and environment. The 11 subscales that we identified kind of speak to how Maryland elected to define school climate. I'm sure that there was a definition in USDE's notice of funding availability as well. But we really were focused more on relationship, respect for diversity, school participation, emotional safety, which I think is a broad category, physical safety and substance abuse, our physical environment, our academic environment, our wellness, and something that Maryland's focused on pretty significantly at the board level on our disciplinary environment. We're in the middle of looking at our codes. We're in the middle of actually recommending new codes for discipline in all of our local school systems. The board has really tackled that one. So, if you talk to the practicing, student servicey, therapist person, it's that real fuzzy, what does it feel like when you walk into school? And I hate to say it, but we really can, especially the folks that are doing the work in these schools. They know when what they're doing is working or not sometimes just by how people are feeling that day when they meet as a team. So it really is an all-inclusive word. It includes academic supports. It includes emotional supports. And it's an umbrella, I would call it, rather than a thing. Do you have anything else to add to that?
I would just say that it's really looking at creating a school that in itself is a protective factor for kids. So a predictable environment where kids feel safe, where there's supports available not only for students, but also for families and for the staff. I think the staff are able to be much more effective in helping kids deal both with academic content and with becoming 21st century learners, thinkers, and productive citizens when the staff feels supportive. So there's got to be sort of a clear mission and a clear way of doing things in the building where everyone feels comfortable and knows that everyone's on board to work in the building for what's best for kids.
Oh, thank you so much. And I guess I'll also toss in, Christina, when you mentioned that, it can be a school can be a support for children. The school climate level can either be supportive or it can be a risk factor. So this is one of the important reasons to measure it, because if it's not optimal or poor, this could definitely be something that, is not helping the child to be learning in a supportive environment. So thanks so much to all of you. And those are all the questions we have in. We want now to just go to some reflections and future directions, kind of summarize or have some bullet points here of takeaways. School climate data aren't just about measuring student perceptions, but also those of school staff and parents. School climate data can be used as a springboard for meaningful improvement efforts through the use of evidence-based strategies and interventions. Multiple data points provide a focused way to begin the journey of implementation, and collecting and reviewing data are key for prioritization and determining the areas of highest need. So I want to thank all of our presenters today. Going forward, if there are further discussions that you would like to see on this topic, please email any of us to continue the dialogue. Our email addresses are here. Mine is here. You can reach me at sruddy@air.org or through the National Center website, which is safesupportivelearning.ed.org. Adam is at avoigt@wested.org, Lisa at lisa.cheney@greenbush.org, Andrea at alexander@msde.state.md.us, and Christina at cjordan@mds3online.org. And if you would, please complete the feedback survey. There is a link in the lower left-hand box that says notes. We would very much appreciate it. And Lisa has also been putting the link in the chat box as well, so you can just click on that. Again, we want to thank everyone for joining, and our last slide here does have information for Bree Martin at Midwest REL and myself, and for the REL Midwest website itself. We've got a few minutes left, so we'll let people go ahead and finish the survey if you would, and we very much appreciate it. So thank you, and we would like to have you finish up the survey, and that will be it. Thanks so much for today.